Okay, welcome everybody. This is our third Zoom meeting for the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy. This week and we are focused on habitat restoration. Our first speaker today is introduced as Kenneth Rangel. Kenneth Rangel is the Restoration Operations Manager for Save the Bay, where he works to engage Bay Area community members to restore wetland habitats for both people and wildlife. He was born and raised in the Bay Area and has been working in the field of conservation and restoration ecology for the past 9 years, doing endangered species monitoring, native plant propagation, invasive plant management, and habitat restoration. Welcome, Kenneth.
Thanks for that introduction, Phoenix. And thank you all for having me here today. I forgot to also lead with my pronouns too. You can use he or they, whichever you prefer. And thanks again for having me here today. I'm really excited to chat with y'all about habitat restoration and ecosystem services of wetlands. I'm gonna start sharing my screen with the presentation I've prepared for y'all. Give me just a moment as I pull this up and get this. Can everybody see the screen, but not necessarily my notes on here?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, great. Tested it out this morning, but I'm much more of an IRL person than an online person. So bear with me for any technical difficulties during the presentation. And again, thank you so much for having me to talk with you all today. Like Phoenix said, we're gonna split the day up, or our 2 hours, into roughly about an hour talking about overview of habitat restoration. So what does that mean? How do you go about doing that? What are the components of a successful habitat restoration project? We'll take a break somewhere in the middle just so folks can use the restroom or grab a water if they need it. And then we'll spend the second half of our day talking about ecosystem services of wetlands. Before I get in, I want to really encourage you all to participate and ask questions today. So however that works best for you, if you want to, at any time, please unmute yourself and ask a question directly. I think on here, the Q&A function shows up for me. If you have a question that you'd rather type in, or if someone has a question in the comments and I haven't responded to it, please just direct my attention to it. I don't want this to be 2 hours of just me talking at you. I'd love to hear some of your questions, share stories, or kind of however you all see is the best use of your time here. So I kind of just want to begin with asking you all, because I'm not sure where you are all coming from in your experience with restoration and conservation. I'd love to hear from you all, like, what does that term habitat restoration mean to you? Do you feel like unmuting yourselves and maybe giving your best guess definition or talking about what you think it might mean? I'd love to hear from y'all if you want to mute yourselves, if you want to chat it, put it in the Q&A. Like, what does restoration or habitat restoration mean to you?
I can go. This is Devaney. I think it literally to me means just restoring something that's been destroyed or improperly used.
Yeah, so there's a restoring, right? Like bringing something kind of back to how it was after, you said something's been like damaged, right? So there's been some kind of damage and we're trying to like restore and repair back to some previous state. I think that's a really good part of that. Does anyone else would like to share? Okay, do something.
All right, this is Oluwole. Habitat restoration can also mean to me when you try to maintain what is in order to prevent it from going, bad.
Yeah, so that's I'm really glad you said that. So trying to like get an ecosystem to a state of like maintenance, right? So it doesn't go back to a damaged or disturbed kind of state. Did I kind of capture that?
Yes. Oh, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good. I'm really glad you brought that up too. So not just trying to restore ecosystems to like this perfect state, right? Because ecosystems are very dynamic, as we'll talk about. You know, we want to restore some of the processes that are maintaining these ecosystems so that hopefully we don't have to keep going in there and restoring habitat every 5, 10, 20 years. Hopefully the goal is once we're done, these systems are kind of self-replicating and doing their own thing without too much human intervention. I'm seeing some other great things in the chat too. So bringing land into a state of wild. I think that's definitely a component of that. I think we'll kind of tease apart like what does wild even mean during this presentation, but I'm glad you brought that up. Prescott said restoring something to its optimal state. I think that's kind of a good thought, right? We're trying to return or restore something back to a better state for sure. Again, ecosystems, as we'll talk about, are really dynamic. There's no, it kind of depends what you mean by optimal and like what you're measuring for, right? Optimal for which species, for who, for what, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that's a great thought as well. Wild meaning non-human animals can thrive. I like that. Yeah, right. Like a lot of the restoration work that we do at Save the Bay is designed to help non-human animals. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Although I hope, and we'll talk about this too, that restoration also benefits people as well, because we are part of the environment just as much as non-human animals are too. And Veronica said, make me think of how it's determined what is a restored state. And that's a really insightful comment. Heard that once we hear frogs, that means a healthy environment. Completely agree. But yeah, so like, that's a great comment, Veronica. Like, what is a restored state? Like, what was here before? How do we know, like, once we've done our restoration work, have we like arrived at, you know, this is I hate to say like pristine, but this is like the goal that we're trying to get to, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And I hope as we're discussing restoration and ecosystem services, some of these comments and questions and ideas that you've all brought up are kind of stewing in your head, and we can really talk about that. Let's see. There we go. So according to the Society for Ecological Restoration, this is like a professional group of people who are all professionals in ecological restoration. They define ecological restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So I think there were a lot of things that y'all brought up, right? Like we're trying to return ecosystems to the state that they used to be in, but were brought into after being disturbed, degraded, damaged, so on and so forth. Like we talked about earlier, ecosystems are really dynamic communities of plants, animals, microorganisms, also all the abiotic features there, the soil which is living, water, geological processes, right, that are all interacting with their environment as kind of a functional unit that we are saying like this is one ecosystem where all these little parts, all these animals and plants are interacting with each other. And we're kind of defining that ecosystem as that place where those things are happening. Ecological restoration seeks to initiate or accelerate recovery following damage, degradation, or destruction. And each of those D words all kind of have different meanings, right? So if something's damaged, right, you can repair that, right? So damage here is like something, a very acute and obvious harmful impact upon an ecosystem. So this might be something specific like building a road through a forest, right? That damages the ecosystem. Maybe the larger ecosystem is still there, but there are some, you know, right around like that road, there are some damage that's been done. Logging could be damage, right? Like we've taken away all of these trees. If you were to leave it alone, eventually maybe those trees are going to regrow and that ecosystem can repair on its own. Maybe you need to come in and replant some of those trees, but it's a pretty specific point where that ecosystem has been damaged, right? Degradation is something a little more chronic, right? So it's a continual process that is resulting in impacts on the ecosystem that are negative. Maybe that results in like a loss of biodiversity. Maybe it means certain species of animals are no longer able to thrive in that ecosystem and are at risk of becoming extinct locally. Something like this, like an example might be like grazing for a long period of time, right? Maybe taking cattle into a place where they used to not be, and those cattle are for years and years and years overgrazing the land, not allowing for the native species to regenerate, and it's causing long-term, like chronic impacts on that ecosystem. And then destruction is kind of on the spectrum of disturbance, kind of the apex of it, right? So we can think of like urbanization is completely destroying that ecosystem. What was there, the components of that ecosystem are pretty much no longer there at all. Things like mining or coastal erosion, all those things are all examples of ecological destruction. Does that kind of, anybody have any questions on that? That kind of makes sense what ecological restoration, the idea of it is. Okay. Oh, sorry, see something in the chat. Okay, awesome. So some of y'all in your comments, you described like, so this damage has been done, right? And we're trying to restore and repair these ecosystems to what they once were, right? So this assumes like a few things that we, maybe that we know what these ecosystems used to look like before this damage has happened. And that's pretty common, you know, we're humans, we have relatively short lifespans, you know, we may not know what these ecosystems looked like before. So next slide. So really, I think this quote really sums up that kind of, that idea that, you know, if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going, right? You can't restore ecosystems if you don't know what they looked like before they were destroyed or damaged or degraded. So knowing that, you know, what was there before is really helpful because you need to know what was there in order to figure out how you're going to restore and repair. So for the next few slides, I'm going to do kind of a big picture look at what California was like before most of our ecosystems were damaged or destroyed. So we're going to do kind of a little bit of a history lesson in some ways. So when I think of California and I think about its ecology, California is a really biodiverse place. So that means there are lots of different kinds of species, animals, plants, insects that live here. And many of these species live nowhere else in the world. So they're all endemic. That just means if a plant or animal is found in one place kind of in the world, it's endemic to that place. And I have a couple examples of species that are endemic just to the Bay Area, not even to the rest of California. They're species that are only found here in the Bay Area. Some of the ones on the bottom, this is a salt marsh harvest mouse on the left. This is an endangered species, so it's at risk of going extinct. And it's endemic to the San Francisco Bay. The only place in the world it lives is San Francisco Bay. If we lose them here, we lose them all across the world. Some other examples, we have the San Francisco garter snake. This is I think it's a really beautiful snake that's only found in San Mateo and San Francisco counties. And it only lives in wetlands as well. not saltwater wetlands like the ones that I'm familiar working in, but in freshwater wetlands. There is the Franciscan manzanita. This is a plant that has a really interesting story. It's a very rare shrub that is pretty much only found, or historically was only found in what is currently San Francisco County. As the city of San Francisco developed, these plants were lost over time. There were a couple that were taken into like botanical collections. So you could go to an herbarium or you could go to a botanical garden, and there might be a couple that were propagated from seeds or from cuttings and were planted there. The question is the garter snake poisonous? It's not poisonous, no. They are pretty harmless to people. I think they might have that bright coloring to warn other predators, maybe to trick predators into thinking that they're poisonous, but they're not. They themselves are not poisonous. It's a great question. So this is Franciscan manzanita. I'm sorry, I got a little off track. This over time, wild Franciscan manzanitas were thought to be extinct in California. There were a couple that were left in collections, and there were a couple that had been planted in botanical gardens. But as the city of San Francisco developed, these were thought to be extinct until just about maybe 15 years ago. In the Presidio, if anyone's been to the Presidio of California, if you've driven like over, from Marin County through the Golden Gate Bridge, you drive right into the Presidio, which is a national park. About 15 years ago, they were redeveloping Highway 101, which goes through there. And one botanist just happened to drive by the construction site and thought he saw like one odd shrub. So he had to like go up over the Golden Gate Bridge and drive back around and do this a few times to get a better look at this shrub that was growing in the middle of a construction project. And he realized that this was one last wild Franciscan manzanita that was left in the world. And the National Park Service spent $1 million to transplant this one shrub out of this construction site where Highway 101 was being redeveloped and to retransplant it back into the wild. And now they're in the process of trying to grow more of these out so that they can be outplanted back into the wild. But it's really amazing that this plant species almost went functionally extinct. And the very, very last wild one was found just by someone driving by on the road. There's a couple other unique, rare and endemic species here as well. There's the Antioch Dunes evening primrose. This is a flower that I got to work with about 8 or 9 years ago. That's only found on sand dunes in the city of Antioch, which I didn't know 9 years ago Antioch had sand dunes, but it was pretty cool. It's found pretty much only there. And then another species that I think is important to talk about is the Xerxes blue butterfly. Out of all of the 5 that endemic species I'm showing you, this is the only one here that is extinct. And this was a butterfly that was known to only be found in sand dunes in San Francisco. And it is the very first insect that was known to go extinct in the United States, and mostly because of habitat destruction. It only grew on plants that lived in sand dunes in San Francisco, so it had a very restricted range. It was not found in many places. It had a very unique habitat. And what I didn't know was that about a third of the city of San Francisco at one point was sand dunes. Most of Golden Gate Park, the Richmond District, the Sunset District were giant, like 90-foot sand dunes that were leveled to redevelop that part of the city. And as a result, this butterfly lost pretty much all of its habitat. And I think in the 1920s or 30s was the last time it was found in the wild. And this is just a small sampling of some of the biodiversity that's found in our state. Also, there's a question about what is peculiar to the salt marsh harvest mouse. That's a great question. I'm going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation about them. But they're a really unique, cool animal. So the salt marsh harvest mouse like I said earlier, is only found in San Francisco Bay. So that's pretty unique in and of itself, right? That there's a mouse that is only found here in the San Francisco Bay region. It has a really unique habitat too, in that it only lives in salt marshes, which are again also a pretty unique habitat. So they only hang out in marshes. They don't hang out in the uplands that are nearby. They're adapted to living in and near water. And they have a couple of adaptations that are really unique among rodents that allow them to live in this pretty harsh environment. So they are able to drink salt water without getting sick like you or I would. They have very efficient kidneys that actually are able to filter out the extra salt in salt water. So they're able to drink that. They're also able to swim too for pretty long periods of time, which is really important when you're living in a tidal habitat, right? That is getting a high tide 2 times every day. Sometimes your home goes underwater. You need to be able to swim until the tides go down. So that's pretty cool as well. And yeah, they're only found in salt marshes, which is pretty unique. There's a whole lot more I could talk about them, but I think I can save some time maybe later because they are pretty interesting and unique animals. But the point I want to make is that California is a really biodiverse place, right? And many of the species that are found here or growing here are also only found here. So just with plants, about 34% of all the native plants that are found in California, about 34% of them are only found here. So if you go just a little bit north up to Oregon, many of those plants don't grow up there. If you go over to Nevada, many of the plants that grow here are not there. And this is because we have a really unique geography and geologic history with a really unique climate that isn't found in other places in the world, or very few places in the world. So plants and animals that are here are often really isolated from one another, and that allows for evolution to happen, which is why we have so many interesting and unique plants and animals that, again, are only found here. And one of the reasons why so many of those unique plants and animals were able to stay here is really thanks to the role that Indigenous people currently and historically have had in maintaining biodiversity here. I think it's really important that, I want to mention, like, I'm presenting today from Bay Miwok land, and Save the Bay does work across Ohlone, like Ramaytush, Huichin, and I think Muwekma territory as well. And Indigenous people have had a really long role here of preserving and maintaining biodiversity as well. Through the different ways that Indigenous people have maintained and stewarded land, usually by clearing land through fire. They were able to preserve and help flush new species and help species that are fire adapted germinate and keep land clear. That helps make space for wildlife and for other plants. And even the way that Indigenous people have harvested plants for, building material or for personal uses or for food was done in such a way that it really regenerated these species. They either only took things when they were ready and only took enough what they needed, or by harvesting them, they actually encouraged a lot of these plants to resprout or reproduce, which helped maintain these plant communities over tens of thousands, if not maybe more years. So I think it's just really important to recognize as well that a lot of the restoration work that we need to do is only a result of colonization, and that had colonization not happened, there probably would not be a need to restore a lot of the environments that we are working in. So I just want to kind of call that out as well. And a lot of the reasons why we have to do restoration are a result of the impacts of colonization. One of which was the introduction of cattle and ranching into California. So historically, from a geologic tens of thousands of years perspective, cattle are not native to California. There are other herbivores, large herbivores that are native to California, Probably all of us are familiar with deer because they're pretty common even in the Bay Area. But there were other herbivores that were found here before colonization as well. Tule elk, like the ones you can see in the top right corner, were pretty common throughout California. In more of the grasslands, we saw lots of pronghorn antelope, which are now pretty rare in California as well as deer. And the way that these native herbivores kind of treated the land, or as the way that they foraged, was much different than cattle, right? So these animals had big predators like mountain lions and grizzly bears going after them. They were forced to move around a lot, which made it so that no one little parcel of land was ever overgrazed, right? And the way that they grazed, they were often very particular about kind of what plant species they wanted to munch on, which helps preserve some species or some kinds of plants in some areas. Maybe it cleared land for other little mammals or birds to utilize. Cattle are very different. So with the introduction of cattle by Spanish and Mexican ranchers back during the Mission and Mexican era of California, tens of thousands of cattle were introduced into the landscape. And cattle behave very differently than elk or deer or antelope. They tend to stay in one spot, and they tend to graze everything as low as they can, which means there's not much left for other animals to use. There's not much pasture or grass for them to eat. And because they don't have as many large predators, because they have people protecting them, they tend to stay in one spot and really compact the ground very hard, which means that native plants have a really hard time regenerating. They have a hard time getting established in really compacted or overgrazed land. And this has led to some other impacts, such as introduction of non-native and invasive species. So pretty much from the beginning that the Spanish came to California, they brought non-native species with them. I remember hearing when I was a kid, learning about the Mission period of California, that the priests, as they were going from mission to mission, would spread mustard seed around, which is what you can see on the bottom left. It's a bunch of wild mustard, and they would do this to mark their trails that they didn't make, and they were just following the trails that Indigenous people had already made. But they were bringing non-native plants with them, and many of these plants were kind of garden variety plants. A lot of them are related to plants that we still eat, like mustard or radish. But they behave very differently when they are out in the wild in places where they have never been before and where they don't have any evolutionary ecological relationships with other plants and animals in that area. So because maybe they don't have predators, there aren't diseases or pathogens that affect them in these new areas, there's kind of nothing constraining them from taking over. And many of these plants often thrived in areas that were overgrazed by cattle, which helped facilitate their spread. And not all non-native species are necessarily harmful. About 1% or less than 1% of non-native species that are found in California are what we would consider invasive. And that just means that if a plant species is invasive, it has some kind of ecological harm associated with it. And that can be a spectrum. Whether a plant is non-native or invasive to one person might be different if you're talking to another person. Those things are all kind of dependent on the ecosystem you're working in. But in general, invasive plants have really negative impacts on the environment. They might reduce the amount of space or resources that are available for native plants. They often provide lower quality habitat for wildlife, right? Because they lack those ecological relationships with those native wildlife that are there. They may provide food or shelter for wildlife during part of the year, but not others. Mustard is a really good example. It's an annual species, so it completes its life cycle in 1 year. So for the 6 months out of the year where it's lush and growing like this, it might be providing resources for wildlife. It might be providing cover to hide from predators. but during the other 6 months of the year, it's kind of a dead husk. It's not really providing a lot of resources for wildlife, unlike the native plants might. They can also even kind of alter some of the ecosystem processes that wildlife depend on. So they might cause more erosion in a place because they don't hold on to the soil as well. They might cause increased fires because they, like an annual, they dry out after they die, which makes them more susceptible to catching fire, unlike native vegetation, which might be more perennial. They might even alter like the chemistry of the soil. So mustard, for example, produces like chemical compounds that are called allelopathic, which just means that they're poisonous to other plants. And that helps prevent other plants other than mustard from growing in areas where the mustard is. So overall, they can reduce biodiversity in that way as well. One interesting example that I want to bring up is the one on the right. There's two species you're seeing on the right. One is a species called cordgrass, and there's a native cordgrass in the Bay Area, and there's also an invasive species of cordgrass that was introduced here from the East Coast. An interesting kind of just story about these this non-native and this native species is starting about 20 years ago, scientists noticed that the two species of cordgrass were hybridizing. So they were able to create, they were able to breed with each other and make this hybrid species that behaved very differently from either the native or the non-native species. It tended to grow very, very densely, like how you're kind of seeing in that top right photo. And it was able to grow, this is a plant that grows in the marsh, usually in the lowest area of the marsh, and in the lowest tidal zone. And it was able to grow even lower than the native cordgrass. So it was starting to overtake a habitat called mudflats, which you'll see when you come out with us in a couple of weeks. And there was a big fear that this plant was going to kind of take over these marshes and choke out any of the native vegetation. And there was a fear that eventually, as sea level rise happens, and we start to lose our mudflats through sea level rise, these plants aren't going to survive those higher sea levels, and they'll all die out. So we'll lose mudflats and marshes at the same time. But paradoxically, there's an endangered species that's shown on the right. This is a ridgeways rail that is also only found in the Bay Area, and it really loves hanging out in these hybrid cordgrass systems. So there's just an interesting tension between, preserving this rail species, this bird that is endangered and also only found here in the Bay Area, but likes this habitat that is dominated by an invasive plant. So there's a lot of work to be done to try and balance those two needs, but that's just an interesting story about invasive plants and how the tensions that arise when trying to manage them. Moving on, also with the impact of colonization and California becoming a state, the gold rush happened. And one of the ways that people, once all of the easy gold was kind of swiped up during the gold rush, what a lot of people moved on to was hydraulic mining, which basically was the process of taking these high-powered hoses and washing away entire mountainsides to get to gold that was kind of deep underneath all of those layers of rock. And this had a huge impact on ecosystems throughout the entire state. So not only did it destroy these habitats that were here on these mountains in the Sierra Nevadas, but all of that sediment also washed down into the watershed, all the way down into San Francisco Bay. And along with this, there were a lot of water projects that took place all across the state. This is an example of the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite, which was dammed in the late 1800s to provide drinking water to us in the Bay Area, and especially San Francisco. There's another really dramatic example in Los Angeles, where the Owens Valley, which is kind of between the Sierra Nevada mountains and the Mojave Desert, was completely destroyed to provide water or drinking water to the residents of Los Angeles. And again, that had really negative impacts on the ecosystems down there, destroying this very wet, lush habitat so that folks in growing cities could have access to drinking water. Which brings me to urbanization. Urbanization and development also had and continue to have really negative impacts on ecosystems across California and across the world. Specifically, in the Bay Area, one of the ways that we continued urbanization was through the practice of bayfill. So bayfill was this practice of basically taking any material that you could get. It could be dirt, it could be sand. Much of the sand from the sand dunes in San Francisco that I mentioned earlier were actually shipped across the city and dumped into the bay, and then other buildings and neighborhoods were built on top of them. Sometimes it could even be garbage or like building debris was basically dumped into the bay so that more land could be made. I'm sure everyone here is kind of familiar with like the 1906 earthquake that destroyed the city of San Francisco and set it on fire. If you want to guess what they did with all of the rubble and debris from that earthquake, I'm sure you can guess they just dumped it into the bay and then built on top of it. And so this had a really negative impact on our wetlands that are in San Francisco Bay as well. A lot of our trash was directly dumped into the bay and usually set on fire. This is a picture from the South Bay, I think specifically like East Palo Alto, where the Palo Alto dump used to be. This is an area called Cooley's Landing. It's since been restored to tidal marsh, but pretty much you could see the fires that they set to all of this garbage from all the way across the bay. And this was a pretty common practice throughout San Francisco Bay. There are still about maybe 24 or so former landfills, not landmine, all across San Francisco Bay that were former dumps. And this continued all across. I think this picture is from San Mateo County, probably pretty close to where the current San Francisco airport is. Much of those runways, again, were built on fill. So just sand, dirt, trash, whatever that was dumped into the shallow areas of the bay and then built on top of. One really fun example of this is from 1929. There was this man who proposed to build out or fill in the bay from Berkeley in Richmond about 3 miles into the current from the current shoreline to basically make a giant shipping channel. And he would have created, he proposed that we would have created these two concrete structures where the current like Bay Bridge and the current Richmond San Rafael Bridge is, that would cut off salt water from the rest of the parts of the bay. And this was all to make, a shipping channel. And thank God this didn't happen. This would have been very ecologically destructive to San Francisco Bay, but this was a pretty common occurrence back in, the early 1900s. And also important to remember that at this time in our history, most of the shoreline around San Francisco Bay was not publicly accessible. It was all owned by commercial and industrial interests. So needless to say, bayfill, urbanization have all had some negative impacts on biodiversity and habitats across the Bay Area. Another one that we like to talk about because it's very important to our work is salt pond production. So salt has always been harvested in San Francisco Bay, but starting in the 1800s, it was produced on a commercial and industrial scale. And this was really important for the gold rush era because salt was a really important component of purifying metal ore. So people who were getting gold from the mountains would bring it back down to the Bay Area and it would be refined here using salt. And the way that salt was industrially made here in the Bay Area was they would go to a wetland. Mostly this was done in the South Bay around like Alviso in San Jose, a little bit done in Hayward as well. They would go to these wetlands and they would basically build a levee around them so that these wetlands would be choked off from the bay. They wouldn't receive any tidal flow, and they would fill it with bay water and let it sit in the hot, hot sun. And that water would evaporate eventually. And as it evaporates, you get these really brightly colored ponds that are actually bacteria. So these are bacteria that are able to live in extremely salty environments, and they produce these very beautiful colors. If you've ever flown into like Oakland or San Francisco airport, you've probably seen some of these ponds as you're about to land. And yeah, there's still a couple of salt mounds in across the Bay Area. Yeah, there's still an active one in Redwood City, and there's one more active one in Newark as well. So most of these now are out of commission. Back in the 80s, it became kind of economically unfeasible to make salt in this way, which resulted in a really cool project called the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. So this is the second largest restoration project in the country. And back in the year 2000, the federal government ponied up a bunch of money to buy these salt ponds from, you know, the private interests and companies who owned them, with the goal of restoring them back into wetlands, which is really cool. We have it's three complexes that they bought up. One was in Hayward at the Eden Ecological Landing Reserve. Another was at the Ravenswood Salt Ponds, which is just on the other side of Highway 84, across the Dumbarton Bridge, and the Alviso Salt Ponds down in the South Bay. Save the Bay also is pretty involved in this project. We are doing restoration work at Eden Landing in Hayward, and one of our large new restoration projects, which we're going to start this winter, is at the Ravenswood Salt Ponds down in the South Bay as well. So just plugging some of our work there. Excuse me. And this is pretty cool. So when we're talking about restoration, right, we had talked a little bit about restoring the processes that that maintain these ecosystems. So knowing what I just told you all about how these salt ponds were, how they were made, then anyone have a guess onto how you would go about restoring a salt pond back into a marsh? Take some of your best guesses. If you want to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. How might you go about restoring a salt pond back into a wetland? So I see desalinate, add sediment, planting native grasses. These are all good. Desalinating, these are pretty salty environments, right? Because these are salt marshes. Adding sediment to the pond is really important in a lot of these places, because sometimes they actually, the sediments or like the ground actually settles down and loses carbon through being exposed during that salt making process. And sometimes more sediment has to actually be brought in to raise the level of these wetlands up so that marsh plants will grow. Sometimes that involves planting native grasses as well in some areas where those native plants can't regenerate on their own. A big way to do that actually is you just break the levees that were built in place to make those salt ponds, so that you're returning the tidal flow and you're restoring that process of tidal action back into these areas. Sometimes that also involves, bringing more sediment in, bringing in some native plants where they can't regenerate on their own. But just to give you all an idea of how fast sometimes this can happen, this is a salt pond, an aerial photo of a salt pond down in the South Bay. And I believe it's in Alviso. And these were one of the first ponds that they restored back to tidal action. So they broke the levee, they breached the levee that was preventing the bay from flowing in with the tide. And back in 2008, you can see lots of bare ground. This is kind of like what a salt pond looks like at the end of the summer, where it's kind of bare ground and very dry and cracked. And pretty quickly, within a year, you start to see a lot of native plants. This is mostly one native plant called pickleweed, but it's the dominant plant in a lot of our salt marshes. You see it really rapidly come in, and after 2 years, it's pretty nearly completely vegetated, which is pretty cool, and I think goes to show sometimes when you just restore the processes that these plants need, they do great on their own. So kind of taking that was a lot of history and a lot of background, but when we kind of put that all together and we look at San Francisco Bay in the past and the present. Oh, I totally mixed up some of these dates on here. But when you look at San Francisco Bay in the past and present, you can kind of get an idea of just how much it's changed over the years. Ignore the dates on the bottom because I messed that up. The one in the middle is what San Francisco Bay looked like in the 1800s. And you can see the one that's mostly all green. You can see just kind of to the extent that salt marshes took up in San Francisco Bay. In some of these areas, these marshes were really, really huge, really wide. In some places, they were about 6 miles away from the bay shoreline. So just pretty enormous acreage too. There was about 200,000 acres of these salt marshes in these green areas back in the year 1800 or so. But as you kind of look through the other 2 photos that I'm really sorry I misplaced, you don't see as much of that green anymore. So through those those processes of salt pond production, urbanization, bay fill, even as well in the North Bay, agriculture, we lost about 90% of our tidal marshes here in the Bay Area, which is a lot, and something that the Bay is trying to advocate for and do is to restore some of those salt marshes. And we'll talk a little bit about why when we get more to ecosystem services. But now I kind of want to get into a little bit about the work that we do, but I also want to talk about some of the limits to ecological restoration too, because I think it's important to be so reminded about what restoration can and can't do. One of the things which I think someone had brought up earlier was, what were ecosystems really like pre-colonization? How do we know what was actually here? There are a lot of records from, early botanists about what plant species were found here and what wasn't. They're, listening to, indigenous people about what ecosystems were like here before colonization. But there's always kind of we're trying to put those puzzle pieces together, right? So we may never really know what these ecosystems used to be like before. We can try our best to mimic or recreate those, but that's always going to be incomplete, right? You can't always put the toothpaste back in the tube once it's out. Another question is are we really able to restore ecosystems given all the needs that society has, right? To house and feed people and make sure we all have enough water. That's always a tension, right? Because restoration is a societal choice, and choices have trade-offs. So something to think about as well. And another one that I'm always thinking about is restoration enough to compensate for loss of habitat? If we go back to what the Bay used to look like, is there any way that we're going to get back to 200,000 acres of wetlands when 7 million people here in the Bay Area live pretty close to where these wetlands once were? Probably not. We're probably never going to get back to 200,000 acres of wetlands. And that's okay. But even if we restore as much as we can, are we going to really reproduce or make up for what was lost? Are the plants and animals that we're trying to protect going to have enough space and habitat, even if we restore as much wetland as we can? That's always a question that scientists are always trying to answer, and we'll probably be studying indefinitely, but definitely something that we want to think about as we're trying to restore these very vast ecosystems. So I want to touch a little bit about some of the restoration work that Save the Bay does. I know I'm running a little bit over my like 1 hour for restoration. That's okay. So Save the Bay, the work that we do, right, in restoration is pretty specific. We do a type of restoration called transition zone restoration. So transition zones are also known as ecotones. And these are areas where the tidal marsh and the uplands are meeting. So an ecotone is kind of like any place where two habitat types are kind of overlapping, right? So if you were to go from a forest and walk into a meadow, the area where those two habitats are kind of intermingling are really special places. That's an ecotone. And what makes them special is that usually you have a different plant community that's growing in those areas that isn't found in either like the meadow or in the forest, right? So for marshes, right, you have certain plants that like to live kind of in this boundary area. And they're also really important for wildlife too. But like I mentioned before, you know, we lost 90% of our tidal marshland, right? And we lost even more of our transition zone because of that. Right now, kind of the current state of wetlands in the Bay Area is there are about 80,000 acres that are currently protected or have been restored or enhanced in some way. And there's another 30,000 acres of wetlands that are planned to be restored. But there's kind of some limits on that. You know, some of that land needs to be bought from like private interests so it can be restored. Money needs to be raised to actually do that restoration work. And yeah, so kind of like where the state of restoration is for Bay wetlands now. But these transition zones that we work to restore are really important because they provide a number of ecosystem benefits or services. So like I mentioned, they're very rich in species. There are some plants that really, really like to grow in those areas that aren't really found in the uplands and aren't found in the marshes as well. They really support endemic plants and animal species, especially two endangered animals that I've already mentioned, but I'll bring up again in a minute. They also act as buffers from like the human world that's in the uplands and kind of protect animals that live in the marsh from terrestrial predators, right? So if an animal is trying to eat another animal that's living in the marsh, they have these highly vegetated transition zones to hide in. Or if there's a big flood and maybe some of these animals, their habitat in the marsh is completely underwater, they have this other area that's slightly higher in elevation where they can go to escape. They also act as accommodation space. So one concern with climate change and sea level rise is that eventually sea levels are going to be so high that we can't support marsh vegetation anymore, that we're going to lose our marshes and they're going to go underwater. Well, having some of these transition zones actually give these wetlands space to rise up in elevation because wetlands are pretty good at keeping up with sea level rise if sea level rise is slow enough because there's lots of sediment and dirt that's kind of suspended in the water in the bay. You know, if you've ever seen the bay and it looks kind of like dirty, that's because there's dirt in the bay, and dirt is what makes marshes grow. So over time, you know, these marshes can kind of keep up with sea level rise, but if it accelerates and it happens really quickly, then they can't. But these transition zones are kind of extra sources of sediment, and they're places where the marshes can rise up with sea level rise as well, if they're well vegetated. And then they also do a lot of other great things. They help cycle nutrients between the marshes and the uplands, and they help minimize pollution that originates from our uplands where we live and minimizes the runoff that can go into the bay and into our marshes as well. And like I mentioned, they're really important habitat for two endangered species that I've mentioned before that are also endemic to the Bay Area. So there's the Ridgway's rail, which is about a chicken-sized bird. It only lives in San Francisco Bay, and it only lives in salt marshes. These are they're very secretive birds, so they're very difficult to see. funnily enough, where we're going to be working in a couple of weeks at the Martin Luther King Jr. shoreline, is oddly enough, it's one of the places where they have the biggest population. I think the last time I've heard, there's about 90 or so of them hanging out in those wetlands. And there's some spots that are really good spots to see them if you ever want to. If you've ever been to the Arrowhead Marsh down on the south side of Martin Luther King Jr. shoreline, it's a great spot to see them. You can always generally hear them. They have a really loud kind of clapping call. So they're sometimes easier to hear than to see because they're very secretive. They like those very vegetated marsh habitats where they can hide from predators. And then there's the salt marsh harvest mouse, which I've mentioned before, also endangered, also endemic to San Francisco Bay, so found nowhere else, and also only live in tidal wetlands. And last I've heard, there's about 2,000 or so left in the Bay Area. So restoring these habitats is really important for them because, like I mentioned, they live in tidal habitats, right? So over the course of a month, they get super high tides. During a king tide, which is like an extraordinarily high tide, most of their habitat goes underwater, which means they don't have a lot of places to hide from predators. And at least for the Ridgway's rail, that leaves them super exposed to getting picked off, particularly by like hawks and falcons. And so they really need these well-vegetated transition zones so that they have a place to go that's high and dry and provides lots of cover from predators, which is why we do a lot of the restoration work that we do. It's mostly to protect and provide habitat for these two animals particularly. That was a whole lot. Does anybody have any questions about anything I just talked about? Please feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat as well. So I'm going to move on a little bit now into like how we do restoration work and kind of like how you plan out a restoration project and what the components of restoration are. Are all these species tagged is a question. So I don't, in this picture, I think only the salt marsh harvest mouse is. And that's because scientists do they try to study them all across the bay. And try to determine like how their populations are doing. So often for the salt marsh harvest mouse, there are biologists who will go out and they'll actually try and capture them in like a little metal cylinder trap called a Sherman live trap. That basically they'll put like food and they'll put like cotton fluff in them so that when any animals in there go in there, they stay warm. But it has a little trap door behind them. So they'll try and capture them and tag them, and they'll do what's called a mark recapture study. So basically they'll go out again, maybe a month later, and depending on how many marked mice they find, they can do some statistical analysis and figure out like how many of them there are. So people do kind of those capture studies for them. People have also done that for Ridgway's rails as well. But what they'll do for them is they'll do radio telemetry surveys. So they'll capture them in a marsh and they'll outfit them with like a little backpack that has like a radio transmitter on them. And scientists will go out and use this kind of like this handheld satellite tool to determine like, are they still in the marsh? Are they moving around? Maybe they'll be able to find any nests that they may have by doing that. So there are lots of scientists that are in the Bay Area who are kind of doing those, tagging them and trying to determine how well those populations are doing. And then could you see a way that high and dry parts of restored transition zones be places for humans to make habitat along with endangered species? Totally, yeah. Like these, I think I didn't even talk enough about how valuable, wetlands are for humans as well to like, and we'll talk a little bit about that with ecosystem services. But a lot of these transition zones are in places that, humans like to recreate in. A lot of our work restoring transition zones are adjacent to parts of the Bay Trail, where people like to hang out and go on walks or ride their bikes. And definitely have a lot of those plants have human uses as well. So a lot of the plants that make good habitat for wildlife are also useful for people in one way or another. And I think maybe during our trip in a couple of weeks at the shoreline, we could talk a little bit more specifically about like what plants make great places for humans. But a lot of, yeah, I totally agree. A lot of these places that we're working to restore are also places where humans, we like to recreate and we like to hang out. Yeah, so the question, are there any benefits to invasive species and native versus non-native, and then the hybrids apparently? Yeah, so I guess for invasive species, it really is context dependent. Because like, another term for invasive species is just a weed, and a weed is just a plant that's growing where you don't want it to. So it really depends. Kind of like I mentioned with the hybrid cordgrass, there is a benefit for the ridgeways rail. It really likes hanging out in those areas because they're very dense and very provide a lot of cover and protection from predators. So in one way, it is beneficial for them. In other ways, it may not be beneficial for all the other organisms that like to live in marshes too. So there are trade-offs, right? And not all non-native species are so bad for the environment that like we need to work to eradicate them. A lot of them are just kind of doing their thing, hanging out in the margins. Yeah, one person's weed is another person's special plant, totally. So, kind of determining that really depends on looking at a species by species case. Lots of, a lot of the plants I like to eat are non-native, right? Like that doesn't make them bad, but if they're having some kind of negative impact on the ecosystem at large, then maybe, having them grow in that place is not the right place for them. There's probably a lot more we could talk about that, and I'm totally open to answering more questions specifically about that as well. But I think for now, I'm going to move on to kind of like how we plan a restoration project. So I know that that's something that you are all interested in doing. So whenever we're first starting a restoration project, I think it's really important. You want to define like the site that you're working at, right? So you want to define like the boundaries of where you're working. You might want to make a map so that you can refer back or show other people, like this is your restoration site. This is where we're working. One example I've shown here, this is a site of some of our different projects that we've done at the Eden Landing Ecological Reserve. And this is all broken down into different sub-sites that we've worked at. So we don't work all across the entire, reserve. We've kind of broken this down into different units where we work, right? And I'll show you some pictures of what these sites look before and after restoration as well. But also important to like save the bay. We don't own any of the land that we work on. We work with partners. So it's really important to get whatever permits or permissions that you need in order to do your restoration project. I'm not sure where you are all planning on doing yours, but that's also really important that you kind of check mark all of those things. Next, you want to find a reference site. So, when we're trying to restore a place back to what it was, we may not know exactly what was there in this area that we want to restore, but we could find a place that is similar and matches it in one way or another. So maybe, it has a similar habitat. Maybe it has a similar structure, like it's, near a hill or, whatever it is. Like it kind of matches what you're trying to restore. And you want to observe what plant species are there and where they grow. Do some of them like to be growing, if you have like water near your restoration site, which ones like to grow near water, which ones like to be higher and drier. And one resource that I really recommend for doing this kind of research is CalFlora. This is a website that's basically an encyclopedia for all things native and non-native plants. It's a really powerful tool. You can search like, what are all the native plants that grow, in this county that are annual plants or trees or shrubs, and it will generate a list of those things for you. It has a really cool tool as well, where you can even go, if you do the what grows here feature, you can find a place that is, your idea of a reference site and search for all of the plants that are found in that area. So it can give you kind of an idea of like, these are the plants that we want to select for in our restoration project. And one example of restoration, a reference site for us, is this one on the left. So this is a picture of Coyote Hills. It is a place that's right on the bay, and it's one of the few places in the Bay Area that still have like intact reference sites. And one of the things we like to look at here is, that's close to the bay. You can kind of see a little bit of the water on the left, and there's this like gently sloping hill, that goes uphill from there. That it's kind of late summer in this picture, so it doesn't look super biodiverse, but there's lots of great wetland plants that are growing just kind of on the margins of the bay there. And you can kind of see a picture on the right is a very old restoration site that the Bay has done. I think this is at the Faber Marsh tract down in the South Bay. And we've kind of tried to match the plants that are growing in this intact reference site that hasn't been disturbed too much to the restoration site that we're working at now. And then kind of once you've determined like, okay, this is where we're working, these are the plants that we think belong here, you kind of want to determine like your baseline conditions at your site, right? So you want to document like what plants are already present here. What is like the soil like? Are the plants that I want to grow here appropriate for this place as it is now? Or are we going to need to amend the soil at all? And then you always want to take like before photos, because those are going to help document, just how much your site has changed over the years. So this is an example. This is one of our sites at Eden Landing. This is, we call this Eden D, because it was, I think, the fourth subsite that we started working at here. And you can see the baseline conditions are pretty bare. So I think this was an area where they had recently repaved the road, or they had repaved the slope. They were going to build a road out to make another parking lot for visitors to access. And this whole area needed to be revegetated, because on the right, you can see there are wetland plants that are coming in and would, make a marsh, and now is a marsh. And I'll show you some later pictures of what this looks like in a second. But so once you've determined like your baseline conditions, you want to make your restoration plan, right? So you're then going to decide which plant species are appropriate for you to plant at your site, and which ones are available. So not all plants that are in your wish list are going to be ones that you can collect for or purchase. So you kind of want to figure out what you're going to plant. Figure out if you need to amend the soil. Can you do that? Is that possible? And then make a plan for, what work you're going to need to do once you've planted your native plants, right? After you've put in all those plants, oftentimes weeds come up, and you're going to have to deal with, how are you going to deal with those weeds? Most plants like to be watered for the first couple of years of their life. So you're going to need to make a plan how often you're going to be able to water them. And then determine like, what does success look like after that? We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment as well. Plants first, and one of the ways you do that is you collect seeds. So this kind of begins, or collect seeds from native plants. Ideally, you're collecting these plants from areas that closely resemble your restoration site. Maybe they're geographically pretty nearby, or they share some other kind of characteristic, like they have a similar climate or similar soil. And that's to ensure that the plants you're putting in are going to be successful, because they're adapted to the environments that you're going to be putting them into. Really important too, like if you're doing any seed collection, that you're only collecting in places where you're allowed to collect from areas we do, or we have a permit. you do any restoration project. And you can collect seeds. You can collect, down here is a photo of a rhizome from a native saltgrass that I've collected. You can plant those into the ground as well, and they'll take off. And another thing to be really make sure that there is enough to once you've collected your seed, you're going to need to store them and you're going to need to clean them, because most of these seeds are growing, are found in like in a fruit or a capsule. And if you want to spread those seeds, or if you want to propagate them, you're going to need to clean them so that you get just excess plant material. That can you all still hear me? Can you type in the chat if you can hear me?
I noticed that you were coming in and out, and I thought it was my internet, but is
Oh,
everyone
okay.
else experiencing that?
Yeah, I am too. Yeah, I think it is
Yes.
on his end.
Me too, I'm having problems hearing you in and out, in and out.
Hopefully, can do. I'm sorry if my internet connection is a little unstable. So once you've like cleaned the seed, you want to make sure that you're storing it in a dry place so that it doesn't get moldy again. Can y'all still hear me? I'm sorry, I'm like a little unclear if.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so once you have your
So I guess we lost him,
Yeah,
and hopefully he'll be back here soon.
should just wait a few minutes.
Sure. Probably a good time if anybody needs to go take a break, go to the
Yeah.
bathroom, get some water, while we wait for him to come back.
Can you share the schedule again? Not the schedule for today, but for the next few months?
Yeah, can I send that by email to you guys?
That's fine.
Okay, cool. Hmm. see if I can get a hold of him.
I'm not quite sure what is going on right now.
Kenneth fell off, and so we're waiting and hoping that he comes back on.
Oh, okay.
Should we stop the recording for the time being?
Yeah, sure. Well,